Welcome to the Journalism Directors Forum. It's a great honor today to have one of our own returned. Steve Harris is a USC grad, and he and Sophie Lafferty were catching up on their days working together at the Daily Trojan, which sounded like a remarkable era. Steve is now an executive in residence with us here in public relations in the journalism school, and brings a remarkable career to bear in the classroom and in our collegial ranks here. We're very pleased to have him. He spent more than 40 years in communications, most of it with U.S. auto manufacturers. I was thinking that you must be one of those rare people who would have a lot of sympathy right now for the people at Toyota who are trying to tell their story.
Kind of a combination of sympathy and glee.
And glee, at least, right? He was vice president for global communications at General Motors until his retirement in October, just last October, and presided there during a period that it is fair to call tumultuous. He was going to be sharing with us information about that. Steve said that he chose his path in journalism, enjoyed that enormously, and then met somebody here in LA from GM who sort of set you off on that route right away. And ever since, he's been thinking that someday he'll buy his small newspaper. His wife, Roddy, we're so glad to have with us, and she says maybe that moment has arrived, but the economic climate, we never know, right? So I'm going to move around there, Steve, and turn things over to you.
Okay.
We're just delighted to have you.
I'm going to just work from the side over here. I think might be the best, so I'm not in the way of the screen. Thank you, Geneva, for asking me to come. I really appreciate it, and it's really great to be back on the campus. It brings back a lot of great memories. I had a wonderful experience here back in the 60s, and I've always remained in touch, but it's great to be sort of an official part of the university. What I'd like to just briefly take you through, and then I hope that you'll have a lot of questions and we can have a discussion about what happened, is really for those of us that were around the auto industry and around GM and grew up with GM in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the unthinkable, and that was GM having to declare bankruptcy in 2009. And then for those of us who were at GM, the thought that it could survive bankruptcy. It was, of course, the jury is still out, but there was the thinking inside was that would be impossible for a car company to survive bankruptcy, that the stigma attached to that, no one would ever buy a vehicle, and so far that has proven not to be correct. I'm just briefly going to take you through how did GM end up in the bankruptcy, the Chapter 11 filing itself, and the 363 sale, which was the type of bankruptcy that General Motors used. The communications challenges that we had as part of the bankruptcy. It was, as you can imagine, new ground for all of us within communications at GM. And then what the new GM looks like today, and then, as I say, I hope we can get into some questions. I couldn't resist putting this up. When I was at GM 3 different times. I went to GM a week after I graduated from USC, and I was there for 13 years. And then I was gone for 20 years, where I was at American Motors, Chrysler, and Daimler Chrysler. Went back to GM, stayed there 5 more years, and then retired, and then was asked to come back again a 3rd time. When I came back the 3rd time, it was early 2006. The first thing I was greeted with was a black cover on Fortune magazine that said bankruptcy. They were the first ones that actually used the word bankruptcy in GM, but it was inevitable for GM. So that happened like 2 weeks after I got back. And a couple of months after I got back, Tom Friedman at the New York Times wrote a column where he said that the sooner that GM dies, this was based on SUVs and gas, and that GM was promoting gas guzzling vehicles and that sort of thing, that the sooner they're taken over by Toyota, the better off our country would be. And I just put this up there to say it's amazing how things changed. I would love to talk to Tom Friedman today and see if he still feels the same way that Toyota should take over General Motors, given some of the issues that they're dealing with. But how did GM end up in bankruptcy? There was a lot going on leading up to 2009. Enormous healthcare and legacy costs that GM had generated over the years. Many people looked at them and said they were gold-plated. Other people looked at them and said that GM was responsive to what the government had been asking large organizations to do to provide healthcare and pension support. A declining market share. Not a lot of people realize that even though GM was the world leader in auto sales for 77 years, up until 2009. They won 77 straight years as the leaders. Still remain the leader in the U.S., although most people don't don't know that, by quite a margin. GM had a declining market share over 30 years. And every year was dropping, and most of that was because more and more car companies were coming into the U.S. market, and the competition globally was a lot more difficult. There's one chair, there's a chair right up here, and there's some at the table. Please join us. Then the capital markets became really restrictive, and of course, the major story to come out of that was Ford was extremely bright or extremely fortunate, one or the other, that they went to the capital markets, borrowed $30 billion plus before the capital markets really shut down. And that is what has seen them through this really difficult time, and why they were able not to have to ask the U.S. government for help. A real tightening of consumer lending. Obviously, leasing and financing of cars is a big part of this market. A big drop in vehicle sales. We had 7 years in the 15 to 17 million unit sales in the U.S., and suddenly we dropped down to 10 million units. That is very difficult for an industry to absorb a drop like that. And we still stay roughly at the 10.5 to 11 million vehicle range. And an inability to cut costs quickly enough, even though GM over time took $9 billion out of its cost structure, it just couldn't cut costs quick enough to keep its finances going. One other thing was going on, and it started here in California, when the housing industry started to tail off. That meant less sales of full-size pickup trucks and sport utility vehicles, because construction workers, when they're not earning as much, don't buy those kind of vehicles to support their activity. And that was huge to GM, Ford, and Chrysler, because more so than a Toyota or a Honda, the American car companies were very dependent from a profitability standpoint on large trucks and pickups. This gives you an idea about the healthcare legacy burden. Between 93 and 2003, the red bar, GM put over $100 billion into its pension and healthcare accounts to pay for obligations that it had to the workforces that it has had over the 100 years of its existence. So you can imagine if we had decided not to try and fund those, and just left it and said, hey, gee, if we don't have it, it'll fall to the government to pick up this, we would have had $100 billion to invest in product and do other things. But instead, during those periods, we did invest in the pension funds and the healthcare funds. And as you can see, the obligations continue and start growing again, even though we reached new agreements with the UAW. So healthcare and pension costs were huge issues for GM. This shows you SAR. This stands for the seasonally annual adjusted rate. This is basically sales. And you can see that for a long time we were up in that 15 to 17 million rate, and then all of a sudden in 2009 it just dropped off a cliff. People just stopped buying cars because they were uncertain about their own financial situation. They couldn't borrow money, so the market really tanked, and this was a huge impact. This just shows what I mentioned, GM's market share. At one time, GM was very close to having 50% of the U.S. market. GM still dominates a number of markets around the world. But in the U.S., you can see that it's slowly been drifting down and currently stands at about 20%. Most people thought after bankruptcy that GM could just be in free fall, that it would drop down to 14, 13% of the U.S. market, but it has hung in there for the last 6 months. And as a matter of fact, in the last couple of months, they've actually picked up a tenth or two of share, which is encouraging. So hopefully that'll continue, and they'll be able to maintain that. It looks like the U.S. is going to look a lot more like Europe going forward, where there's a half a dozen manufacturers, each that have somewhere between 8 and 12% of the market. And it looks like the U.S. is going to look more like that as time goes on. And since this has happened, China has become the #1 car market in the world, overtaking the U.S. by a substantial amount. And that just continues to boom. Just to show you the deterioration in the balance sheet, I am not a financial person, so I don't claim any expertise here, but you can just see the liquidity, even though it was still $14 billion, at any given time, General Motors needs $7 billion in the bank just to operate on a daily basis, just to pay suppliers and payrolls and the various activities. So 14 is getting really pretty close. And you can see cash flow really deteriorated. Pension got underfunded as the value of the stock holdings decreased, not just for GM. GM did better than the market in its pension fund, but still after putting $100 billion in, was still $25 billion light in 2008. And some of the other, the debt structure and that sort of thing. And you can see the book equity dropped to minus $85 billion. A lot of things were being done trying to avoid this. I mean, a lot of people look at sort of what's called the old GM and the old GM management and say that not much was really attempted to manage this situation. But in 2007, a landmark agreement with the UAW was reached for a VIBA healthcare trust. And basically it was to cap the cost of health care for GM, give a large sum of money to the UAW, the union, which the amount was $30 billion as I remember, and tell them, okay, you take over the health care. You provide the health care for your people. This has been tried in some other industries like the rubber and tire industry and some other places, but it was a way to get at the health care issue and say, this is it, we're going to sort of draw a line in the sand and we'll transfer this responsibility to the UAW with our funding. You can see we did have a significant reduction in the number of hourly employees, 47% reduction between 2004 and 2008, 28% reduction in salaried employment over that time, reduced manufacturing locations from 64 down to 47 in 2008. Cost structure took, as I mentioned earlier, $9 billion out of that. So a lot was going on, and we were doing well in other areas, particularly Asia and South America, where in South America, GM has traditionally been strong. Chevrolet is a very strong brand. And in Asia, China in particular, GM has been extremely successful in a very competitive environment. Around October, November, it became very clear after GM researched every possible available source of funding that there was going to be no choice but to go to the U.S. government and seek support. And I mean, when I tell you we looked everywhere, we looked everywhere. We went to some very strange places looking for money, but it became clear in October, November that we were going to run out of money in early 2009 if we didn't get some help. So we went to the government. We entered into finally on December 31st, like within hours of the deadline of reaching an agreement, we were finally told that we would get some help. We were asked to develop and implement a revised plan based on what we had submitted. We reduced the unsecured debt to $27 billion by, this was what we were told we had to do, by 2/3, which means we had to negotiate with all the debt holders. The UAW VIBA obligation had to be funded by no less than 50% equity, which the union obviously wanted more equity than that. Did not want to have stock and that sort of thing. We had to reduce the wages and benefits to be competitive with transplants, with folks like Toyota and Honda and Nissan that manufacture in the U.S. So it was a very stringent set of requirements that we were asked to do. So we went out and went as far as we thought we possibly could in achieving those things. Now on the 17th, we submitted the second viability plan. At this point, it was President Obama. And he announced on March 30th that the plan was not satisfactory. Even though it met most of the requirements, there were some things that just couldn't be done. The debt holders, for instance, were not going to accept, at least from General Motors, 10 cents on the dollar for their debt, and we just couldn't reach an agreement with them. We got most everything done with the UAW, and then the President and the Automotive Task Force that he had put in place sent June 1 as a deadline to demonstrate that we could go even further. I think everybody knew that it was highly, highly unlikely that we were going to be able to accomplish that, but we went back at it. So the 60 days leading up to actual Chapter 11, we continued to implement the operational changes that we were making at GM, reducing manufacturing locations and trying to cut costs as much as we could. We started sort of a dual path across all the work streams within the company, pulled together teams about, here's Plan A, which is hopefully no bankruptcy. Here's Plan B with bankruptcy, and had two different teams working on what needs to be put in place to get ready as if that event does occur, and if not, how do we pull out of that and keep going forward. We launched a bond exchange offer to the bondholders at the end of April. As I said, that was not met with much positive reaction because they were asked to take a huge haircut on their holdings. We temporarily shut down our facilities so as to not have too many vehicles and to not And also, we also needed to reduce the supplier payments that we were making, so we couldn't afford to be having parts shipped into the plants at that time. We reached an agreement with Delphi, which once was a part of General Motors. It was the parts-making operation of General Motors, and they had been spun off from GM, and then they entered bankruptcy, and they were having a difficult time coming out of bankruptcy, and we finally reached a financial agreement with them where GM would provide help to Delphi with their reorganization, which was a big part because if Delphi didn't exist, no components, no parts, no GM, and of course the whole industry would be impacted because virtually every automobile manufacturer that builds vehicles in the U.S. gets parts from Delphi. Then we reached an agreement with the U.S. Treasury and the Canadian and Ontario governments for debt and lender financing. Our problem was most people that go bankrupt go to the banks or other lenders to get their financing. That was not possible for GM because the banks, A, weren't lending, and B, there was nobody who was going to step up to $50 or $60 billion, which is what was required to finance a bankruptcy the size of General Motors. So we finally obtained the support of the bondholders for a 363 sale. Quite frankly, it was the government basically saying, this is it or nothing. It's either what we're willing to give you, or we'll go through bankruptcy and you'll be wiped out entirely. Chapter 11, on June 1st, we sought relief under the Chapter 11 bankruptcy code in New York. It was a very strange day as we prepared for that. It went down to the wire because certain things had to fall in place, and we really weren't sure if we were going to make it in time. And as I remember, we went till about 2 o'clock in the morning finalizing the Canadian government agreement to do that. But then we did file. We got the financing provided by the U.S. and the Canadian governments. Non-U.S. operations were excluded from the bankruptcy. So we had a very different story to tell outside the U.S. It was very much business as usual in Europe and China and South America and every place else we operated. But there was a time on the June 1st or the 31st of May that we really didn't know that. There were some countries outside the U.S. that we thought were in jeopardy, and it went down to the wire. Normal business operations, and then under a 363 we sold substantially all the assets to the U.S. Treasury. Today, I'll show you a graph a little later, the U.S. Treasury, the taxpayers in the U.S. own 61% of General Motors currently. The sale closed on July 11th and GM began the new operations. The real concerns about a bankruptcy, and we had done quite a bit of research, and the reason that people at GM were so concerned could GM survive a bankruptcy was that it takes a long time, especially something the size of a General Motors. The thought was this could take well over a year, if not more. But it went through in 40 days, which was just totally unheard of. And had you not had the U.S. government pushing it through the way they did, and you got to remember Chrysler went ahead of us, and that went through in a very short period of time as well. And so that encouraged us that, well, maybe this can be done, even though Chrysler was much smaller and a much different arrangement with Fiat of Italy than GM was. So it was amazing that it went that fast. Nobody really thought that was possible, just to physically do all the steps that you needed to do, but somehow, some way, with a massive effort, we were able to do it. Just quickly take you through some of the communication challenges. Rick Wagner is up on the top left, was the CEO that was there at the time, and maybe the toughest day in my communications life. Rick and I are very close. He was the reason that I came back to GM. A really decent person, a really good guy. But he went for a meeting with the U.S. Automotive Task Force, had no idea. They brought him into an office and said, we're gonna take you out of the CEO role. And so an hour or so later, when he gets back to the office, he calls me to tell me what's happened and that we need to start getting prepared to let employees know what's going on and make the public announcement. And very difficult time trying to deal with somebody that you're a close friend with as well as a working associate, and knowing that they're going through. I mean, this guy bleeds GM blue, and it's been his whole career, his whole life, 30 plus years working for GM. And then Fritz Henderson, who was a longtime GM guy and also had been mentored by Fritz, came on in March as the new CEO. He lasted a short time before Mr. Whitaker, who is the former CEO of AT&T, was named by the government to be the new chairman of General Motors. and the new head of the board, the new chairman of the board. And then he just recently took over the CEO responsibilities as well. So in a very short time, from November of 2008, even later than that, February 2009, to February 2010, 1 year, we went through 3 CEOs. So pretty traumatic for any organization to go through that. Communications-wise, we had the first phase was to assure everybody that during the bankruptcy period that we were still in business and that we were paving the way for emergence, and that was basically during the bankruptcy hearing period. And then from then on, we were trying to communicate the reinvention of General Motors, of what the new GM would look like and why that should matter to consumers. I won't spend a lot of time in this area, but there was a huge amount of preparation. Remember, this was a global story. It's not something you get to practice, bankruptcy, so you don't have a lot of experience. Fortunately, there are people out there that their whole lives are bankruptcy, and from a communications perspective and otherwise, and we had a lot of good outside experts that were there to advise us, look over our shoulders, help us develop plans. But it was a great team effort. It was probably this was maybe the saddest and most challenging thing I ever went through in my career, just because of my closeness to the industry and to GM and the people. It was maybe the most rewarding experience, because the way the team really pulled together, and we learned a lot during this process. We had Saab going bankrupt at the same time. This story was playing out all over the world, and so we had to coordinate the 600 people that do communications for GM that are scattered around the globe. We also got a break in that we did get to monitor what Chrysler was doing, and we could take a look at what worked, what didn't work, and learn from their activity, because they were just a month or so ahead of us. We had a really good proven infrastructure in place, a lot of people, internal capability, and a lot of people that knew what they were doing and took care of their own areas, which was really helpful, because getting good information was difficult. One really interesting thing, GM has a lot of call centers where people call in for questions about whether it be their stock, their product, their GMAC, loans, whatever. And we were terrified of what was going to happen on the day that we announced bankruptcy, because everything we studied said that the call centers would just be overwhelmed with people saying, what do I do with my car? Where do I get it serviced? What about my loan on my car? We actually had fewer calls on the day of and after the bankruptcy than we had on a normal day. I don't know how to explain it to you, but either we did a great job of communicating, or people just, after the Chrysler experience, were sort of used to this and they didn't overreact to it. But it turned out not to be a big deal. But we spent an incredible amount of time and money preparing the call centers to be ready for this. We established customer care and supplier care centers, because our suppliers, of course, our biggest fear leading up to bankruptcy was our suppliers would demand early payment. There's a very disciplined way where suppliers are paid over a 90-day period, but they have the right to demand payment for parts they delivered immediately. If we had that kind of a run on the bank at GM, that would have been catastrophic and would have put us into bankruptcy much earlier than we were prepared for. We planned a lot of measurement and monitoring to make sure that we understood how the messaging that we were putting out was being received, and if we needed to adapt it. I won't spend a lot of time. I just want to show you that we did look at every audience that we thought we had, and we had a specific plan for each audience and people that were responsible. So obviously employees and retirees were not a real happy group with GM, by the way. So normally you'd expect retirees to be very supportive. They were not happy because almost all of their benefits had been decimated, if not eliminated. Pensions had been impacted. So there was not as much support as you might think, but we needed to keep them as close to us and as informed as possible. Suppliers are critical, obviously, to keeping them engaged and keeping them aware and answering any concerns they have. Customers, obviously key audience, and we reached out through a variety of methodologies there, and I think did a fairly effective job. Dealers, very important. GM does not own the dealers. The dealers are independent business people, something that most people don't really understand. But very important to keep them in the game, keep them positive, and keep them selling product. And then government officials and community leaders. A lot of people always ask about how much government control there was. There really was very little. They were very interested in what we were doing from a communication standpoint. I cannot say that they really exerted much control, if any. Once or twice they said, we really like it if you would add this message or this communication into your plans, but it was really minimal. It was not overbearing at all. Security analysts, another key group for GM. So you can see the audiences go on and on and on. A lot of people to take care of, a lot of things to coordinate. And once again, almost all of this is happening on a global basis. We had President Obama on the June 1st announce at a press conference. We immediately followed with our own press conference. We had GM executives doing interviews over the next 3 days. We did over 200 individual interviews. We did 3 analyst media calls over those 3 days. And we had an aggressive third-party engagement program. We contacted over 30 days. We identified 15,000 people that we thought had some connection to GM. Could be somebody at a charitable organization we support, supplier, an academic, all sorts of people. And we just tried to engage them and make sure that they understood our messaging and what we were going through. And out of that 15,000, we identified 600 that really wanted to be involved. And then we, out of that group, we found about 60 that really wanted to do a lot of media work for us. And they became our spokespeople. They would call us and say, gee, I can be on CNBC tomorrow talking about the bankruptcy. What are the messaging? And what is the messaging? So they were very, very helpful to us, and something that we probably should have done a long time ago. Biggest risk and opportunity was social media. We did a lot in that area. It was maybe the first time it was ever really used. This is Fritz Henderson. I think it's important that he was probably the first CEO, and I think he's the first of that generation, that they're very comfortable with social media. And so social media will take on a larger and larger presence as far as, he liked to blog, he liked to use Twitter. He did it with his own children, so it was natural to him. We had a team that was basically 24 hours a day, active on social media telling the story. We got some nice kudos from people about the aggressiveness that we did in the social media area and the effectiveness of it. And they saw it as very transparent compared to what they'd expect GM or a large corporate organization going through something like this. And just quickly, the new GM, this is the new vision. I tried forever when I was there to get a vision that was easier to understand and more direct. GM had a very convoluted 3-paragraph vision for most of its existence. But now it's just to design, build, and sell the world's best vehicle, something everybody can understand, and I think they can understand how they play a role in that. This is how things have changed. U.S. brands before, you can see in the year 2008, there were 8 brands. Today there are 4 in the U.S. Nameplates, individual models, there were 48. There were 45 at the end of 2009, and the target is to be down to 34. So fewer vehicles, more resources to focus on that. Greater differentiation between the vehicles is the goal. Dealers, this is very controversial, but GM had a very large dealer body. Even today, if GM was to reach their goal of getting down to 3,600 to 4,000, it would still have 3 times more dealers than Toyota has in the U.S. But yet we have a lot of dealers and Congress that we're going through a lot of arbitration about the dealers that we did elect to reduce. So we'll see what happens there with that, what ultimately, and employees down to 70,000 from 91,000, and that number may go slightly back up because GM is talking about reopening some plants now as demand is coming back for some of the new products. They're talking about bringing some plants back up, so the numbers might actually start building back up. Creating momentum, we got a whole new board of directors. There were a few carryover people from the prior one, but the government named a whole new slate, new vision which I went through, implementing the North American plan, which is to totally redo the model lineup here and the brands. Restructuring European operations, we need to get smaller there. GM has had a real roller coaster ride in Europe. We've been number 1 in Europe and number 5, and more recently we've had some downtimes there, so there's quite a bit of effort to rebuild. Tried to sell Opel, that didn't work, so GM has now decided to really invest in it, and we'll see how that works out. The plan is to repay the taxpayer loans, not the total amount that was turned into equity, but there's about $6 billion in loans that will be repaid before June. And then hopefully when the company goes public again, which is hopefully going to occur late this year or sometime in 2011, then the government can sell off its stock and hopefully get back its $60 billion that was invested. A lot of people think that's a long shot, but just recently, if you look at the current issue of Barron's, they have a major story on GM that that they think the IPO is going to be one of the most successful IPOs ever, and the company could be worth $50 to $65 billion after the initial public offering. So we'll see. Ownership structure, it shows U.S. Treasury 61%, Canadian Ontario government's a little under 12%. The new VIVA, which is the UAW healthcare agreement, that has about 17.5%. And then the old GM continues to have a 10% stake. Once again, just what happened to manufacturing facilities, hourly employees and salaried employees significantly lower, and legacy costs, of course, are going to be minimal. Huge debt reduction from $95 billion in debt down to $17 billion following the bankruptcy. This gives GM a very strong balance sheet compared certainly to Ford and some other competitors. Very strong cash position, $42 billion in cash. 16 of it is in escrow. That'll be used to pay back the loans, and the rest of it will revert to GM. So a strong cash position. We've repaid some of the loans that were made earlier. I still use we. And then just real quick, looking forward, some really strong positive reaction to new product. The Camaro has been super hot. A convertible version of this comes out this coming fall. This is a Chevy Equinox. Roddy and I bought one of these when I left GM. It's a great vehicle. But it's a new sort of a mid-sized crossover vehicle, doing extremely well, selling as fast as they can build them. The Buick LaCrosse is doing extremely well. This was designed by GM China, this vehicle. It does very well in China, but as a premium vehicle, doing very well in the U.S. We sell more Buicks in China than we do the U.S. now. GMC Terrain is also a small crossover vehicle, very similar in size to the Equinox. Cadillac SRX, another crossover vehicle. This is where a lot of the market's gone to, from people that used to drive SUVs or minivans or station wagons, currently are gravitating to what are called crossover vehicles. And this is the Chevrolet Volt, the electric vehicle that GM will be introducing by the end of this year. We just had a couple representatives from the communication team in my class and Gary's class yesterday to talk to our students. This is a big thing for GM. This will be a big image booster if it works the way it's intended to. So far, everything looks really good. It gets 40 miles. You go 40 miles on pure battery charge. Then it has a small gasoline generator that will provide electricity after that, so you can go an additional 300 to 350 miles off of that. But you're always driving on electricity. So people think this is a real clever answer to an electric vehicle, and hopefully it'll be well received. First year the volumes are low. You're talking about 10 to 15,000. But when they get to the second and third generations, hopefully these will be selling in the hundreds of thousands, and they'll be able to get the pricing down. That's it. I'd be glad to take any questions and discuss anything you'd like to know more about. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Privilege here and ask you the first question. I did notice that you were saying we. Was it tempting to stick around and be part of the new vision with all those good figures?
You know, it is, and it's really, I find myself, that even when I was doing some of the slides, find myself talking like I'm still there. You know, when you spend that many years in the industry and that many years at a company, you're very attached to it. Quite frankly, I was, when I retired in October, I was just a couple of months shy of 64. I could have worked one more year. And I was willing to do that. And I had a conversation with Fritz, and Fritz was under a lot of pressure to show a new team there. And so I would say 70% of the senior officer group either retired or were asked to leave or moved on to something else at that time so that he could make that statement. Unfortunately for Fritz, it didn't save his job, but they felt very, very strong they needed to make a move and have a different group of people, and they're leading it. So, and the person that replaced me was a guy that I had worked with at Chrysler and at GM, Chris Preuss, and I had a lot. He was my VP of communications in Europe, and I had a lot of respect for Chris, and I know he'd do a really good job. So I was fine with it. Yeah.
Questions? Comments? All right.
I want to switch to Toyota. Continuing catastrophe.
Unbelievable.
After these catastrophes, we're always told, if only they had gotten the full truth out and got it out quickly, they would help us. What else could they have Toyota besides that?
Well, I mean, they have a problem in that, I don't know, I don't know that they know what the issue is. Even though they said floor mats and the gas pedal, a lot of the vehicles that have had supposed incidents of sudden acceleration are not covered by those recalls. So a lot of people believe there is an electronic glitch. That's the last thing you want to hear because there is no fix for that, really. It's kind of a mystery. There's so much electronics, like the Chevrolet Volt has 20 computers in it. So these vehicles today are very sophisticated. It's drive-by-wire. There's not a lot of mechanical connections anymore. So they're very sophisticated. I think they would have been better to upfront to admit that they didn't know what the cause was, to say that to launch with the government, a huge investigation, which hopefully would have found there isn't an issue. It's a very rare occurrence still, and virtually every manufacturer has some level of accusations of sudden acceleration. Just for some reason, Toyota has had a slightly higher level, but when you're in this situation from a communication standpoint, you're looking for a clean point. You're looking for that point where you can say, we're done, we've taken our beating, we've stepped up to this, we're going to take care of this issue and these people. They just can't seem to find that. I mean, even beyond the sudden acceleration, they had the oil line recall 2 days ago for 1.1 million vehicles. Then they have the leaked documents coming out. So they're in a really, really difficult position. And if someone would ask me, could I ever imagine Toyota going through this, it would have been inconceivable. But just like bankruptcy was for GM, I guess anything is possible. I have a good friend, Jerry knows him, Dan McGinn, who's a crisis communications guy out of Washington, D.C. And he said the worst things that can happen to you is to be the biggest, best, or first in anything. And when you reach that, you are a big target. So I don't know what the answer is going to be for Toyota, but I'm sure every day they are praying for something to take them off the front pages of the paper.
Yes.
Hi, Shuna.
I was wondering, was there a different impact of the bankruptcy of GM on sales of the brand in different markets, say in US, or in China and in Europe? And do you have different strategies and messages to those specific markets?
We did. I mean, the people that were in the different regions, like particularly China or Europe, were very quick to say, this is only in the US, it does not impact us. Our money is separated from that. We're not dependent on the U.S. for our operating money or our investment money. So those are the kind of messages that we put out there. We also talked about our dealers and our customer service and staying close to the customer. And really we didn't see much impact around the world. There was obviously huge coverage. We had 24, 48 hours of incredible coverage, and in the U.S. it lingered on for quite some time. But around the world, it was not nearly as difficult as we thought. The most interesting thing was why the GM brand took a big hit. We thought that would translate to Chevrolet and Buick and the other brands. The consumer, GM is unusual. It's the only car company in the world that doesn't go to market as its corporate name, as General Motors. GM doesn't sell anything as a General Motors. There's not a General Motors Camaro. There's a Chevrolet Camaro. And the consumer-facing brands, when we did the research after the bankruptcy, suffered very, very little damage. And a matter of fact, you saw the presentation the other day, the imagery of GM has really come up substantially and is doing extremely well. And unfortunately for Toyota, fortunately for GM and Chrysler, Toyota's problems are only going to help that because that piercing of that invincibility of Toyota will make people a little more willing to accept the good aspects of a General Motors or a Chrysler or a Ford or other manufacturer.
Yes.
I'm curious about the Volt. My understanding is that they're going to lose money on every unit it's sold for some time. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that's true. Whenever you bring out a new technology, the Prius, the first 2-3 years, maybe even a little longer, they're currently on the 3rd generation of the Prius. This will be the 1st generation. It's very expensive. GM will definitely lose money on every one they sell. But what you want to do is, as quickly as possible, get to the 2nd and 3rd generation, because then, number one, you bring the cost of the technology down. And GM, while it was developing the Volt, is already well along on generation 2 and even working on generation 3. So hopefully, as you bring the cost down, you get the volume up, and then you can start making some real money. But it'll be 3 to 5 years before GM makes significant money. A lot of people wanted to portray the Volt as the only hope of GM going forward. internally, we never, it's very important from an environmental and technology image. Could be very important from, you know, a powertrain and volume image eventually. But initially, it was always realized this was going to be a very low volume product in the first couple of years. And if we were depending on the Volt to pull us out, we weren't going to make it because it's just not big enough volume.
And I'm sorry, I follow up. Where is that car going to be assembled? Is that
In Detroit, the old Pole Town plant, if you remember in Hamtramck, Detroit,
Sure.
they've reconverted that. Where the batteries, the cells for the batteries, there's a 6-foot high, 800-pound lithium-ion battery that goes into this vehicle. And the cells are produced by LG Chem in Korea. They're about, I think Rob said they're going to announce on March 12th that they're going to manufacture those cells in the U.S. for GM. And then GM built a plant to assemble the battery in the Detroit area. Very small right now, just 100 employees, but they're all being assembled there.
Did you say 6 foot high?
Yes, the battery pack in the car goes from right around where the shifter is on the floor to, and then it tees underneath the rear seat. So it goes all the way down the center of the vehicle and tees out across underneath the seats. It's a huge battery. I think 16 kilowatt hours is the power, as I remember.
Wow.
It takes 8 hours to recharge it if you're in a regular 120 outlet like here, and if you have a 240, you know, like you would use for a washer, dryer, or something like that, it takes 3 hours to recharge.
You can do it at home.
Yeah, you can definitely do it at home, which is, you know, the big advantage of electric vehicles over hydrogen fuel cells, which a lot of people see as the long-term future for automotive, but the infrastructure doesn't exist for hydrogen at this point in time.
I noticed there was a lot of different areas of information, really specific information, and it's probably really difficult to be an expert in all of those areas and communicate that effectively. Can you describe how how you work with your team to kind of generate all that?
Well, the team is divided up into a lot of those areas. I mean, in the U.S. we had, at the time of the bankruptcy, about just under 300 people. Today there's just about 100 people. 2/3 of that group was let go over a period of time following the bankruptcy, which was traumatic to go through, I can tell you. But they're assigned to the various areas. So, you know, there are communications people that just work with the dealers and the sales organization. There's a big group of people that are involved in internal communications and cultural change and that sort of thing. Big group of technology people, financial PR people that spend a lot of time very closely connected with the chief financial officer and his staff and the Wall Street people and the analysts that follow it. So there was expertise within communications, and then you're closely linked with the other organizations within GM. So it's a big group. I mean, I used to kid people when I would open up the Wall Street Journal in the morning. Usually if I went to the index of companies, there was anywhere from 8 to 12 stories on General Motors, and I felt if I knew about half of them, it was a great day. Because there's so much going on at a place like GM, and now globally, it's just impossible to keep up with it. You have to have a lot of faith in the people that you've got out there that have responsibility for those various areas. Good people, really good people.
And then back.
Okay, thank you. Who do you see as the biggest competitors of the Volt? Is it 2011 Prius?
Well, the Volt is a little bit unique in that, unlike the Prius, we talked about this in class a little bit yesterday, the Prius has a battery that takes you for the first 10 or so miles. It's good for that, but once you get above 25 or 30 miles per hour, then it's a regular gasoline engine kicks in, and that engine actually drives the wheel. Where the Volt generates, its engine generates electricity, which then powers an electric motor. So it doesn't have a transmission, it doesn't work like a normal vehicle. So everybody has a slightly different concept. Like for instance, the Nissan Leaf that we talked about is a new all-electric vehicle, but that's pure battery. It's an even bigger battery than the GM battery, and they claim a mileage of about 100 miles. Big concern about that is what's called range anxiety. When you get up close to that 100 miles, you start saying, where am I going to plug this thing in? What's so great about the Volt is once you run out of your battery charge, you can keep using gasoline and creating electricity forever. That's what you wanted to do. But 78% of the people, this is amazing statistics, 78% of the people in the U.S. don't drive more than 40 miles a day in their daily commute and activity. So if they stay within that 40 miles a day, come home, plug in it overnight when there is surplus electricity available in the off-peak hours, they can recharge the car overnight and maybe never buy gasoline if they just stay within 40 miles a day every day. So it's a very interesting concept. So everyone is a little different. Everybody will have to market theirs to the strength of their vehicles. Each one has something to offer. But I don't think there's any question that electric vehicles are really the wave of the future. And even a fuel cell vehicle is just a chemical battery. It's just another way of creating electricity.
Yeah.
I had a question about the upper management personnel image that was so hit on in the Senate hearings. You know, how
I was
you got
there.
here on your private plane.
Yeah, I was there on the private plane.
Did the company do anything to address that image of big bonuses and private planes and a lot of spending?
Well, the plane issue, you know, it's funny. I mean, it's probably, if I regret anything in my career, it was that no red flag, no radar blip went off about that. And to make matters worse, we should have, because we had an investigative reporter in Detroit that was really active around the plane issue. And we dealt with it in Detroit, and naively, it just never occurred to us that he would pick up a phone, call somebody at the network, and say, gee, these clowns are going to take a private plane to this hearing and ask for money. You'd have to be in the organization and understand how routine the use of those planes were. And it was a board regulation that all the top 5 guys could only fly on the private plane. They were not allowed to fly commercial for security and use of time reasons and that kind. And that was over like a 15, 20-year period. It was not something really new. But we really blew it on that. So no, we totally, I would say there were 25 people that knew about this local controversy about the plane, and none of us came up with the thought of, well, gee, maybe we shouldn't take the plane, or maybe we should get the 3 CEOs on one plane, which would never happen, by the way, but we could have tried. And I got to tell you, even if I had gone to Rick Wagner and say, you know, Rick, I think you ought to take a commercial flight there, I think he would have said, what are you talking about? The bank, you know, the banks flew their planes in there. Nobody said anything about the banks flying planes or anything. So that was really a hard one. As far as the imagery of the pay and bonuses, I mean, if you look at GM, nobody does this in a non-emotional way, but the pay of auto executives and the bonuses they receive is so low on the totem pole. I mean, they make a salary of like 1.6 or $2 million compared to these guys that are getting $10 million and $30 and $40 million bonuses. It wasn't even close. So while we tried every year to explain our compensation, where our rank was, it didn't seem to make any difference, because what they would do is take the biggest number they could generate, which usually was to take stock options, which had no value, and say, if they are worth this, then this person's going to get whatever, $20 million, $30 million. So we worked at that every year. We were totally unsuccessful at it. People just want to believe that all corporate CEOs are overpaid and greedy, and it's a tough battle.
I mean, the numbers you just presented as low salaries, I don't think anyone in the general public is talking about.
But not everybody has a $180 billion company they're running with 600,000 employees.
Yeah.
So when you look, if you look at it, okay, what's the cost per employee? It's pretty small. And so if you look at that as the scale of the organization and the responsibility, it's pretty compelling that, hey, maybe this isn't overpaid. Or if you compare it to entertainment salaries or athletic salaries or whatever, it's pretty small on that scheme.
If you could dunk a basketball, though, that we'd appreciate.
Well, Rick Wagner could. Rick actually played basketball at Duke, so he could dunk a basketball.
What about the coverage? Let me just throw that out. Who would you say covered it best? Were there a lot of people covering it in that sort of don't let the facts get in the way of a good story way?
It would depend on the individual. I would say overall, the New York Times provided the Bloomberg, Wire, and the New York Times probably provided, I would say, the most objective and comprehensive coverage. The Journal did a good job, depending on the individual that was working on the story, I think. There were some people that were absolutely fantastic and terrific and really understood what was going on, and wrote stories that were very tough, difficult to deal with, but very fair. And then there were some others that seemed to take a fair amount of glee in the discomfort and the pain that the company was going through. It was kind of a "I told you so" type attitude.
Yeah. Did I see your your hand, Jonathan? Yeah.
When you were here studying journalism at SC, was there anything that you kind of that popped out for you that you remember about how it was taught back in the 60s?
Well, it was such a simpler world then. But I found a lot of the basic lessons that I learned in the journalism courses about how the news media works, what the news media values. Those were things that still were very valuable to us going through this crisis. They still rang very true. And relationships were key. That was something that I remember was emphasized when I was at SC in the 60s about working relationships, and that in the end is what really defines how you're going to do relationships inside and relationships with the media and the other constituencies that you have. So yeah, I think I was prepared pretty well, although I must say when I talk with students here today, I realize how much more sophisticated and further along they are than we were at the time, although we were dealing in a more simple environment at the time.
Sure. Yeah. Steve, I'm wondering about when you look at issues like closing plants and reducing that incredible number of dealerships from a very large number to a really tiny number, relatively speaking, what were the political aspects of that? The decisions weren't entirely in GM's hands like that, and there was a lot of political influence. How did that play out?
Really, I mean, there's a lot of political influence, but most of the decisions were GM, and most of them are driven by economics. They're driven by the age of the plant, the level of the equipment that's in the plant, how much it would cost to get the plant up to a modern level or whatever, if that was necessary, where we have capacity in other places that we could use and shut this down and that sort of thing. The only place that really, where politics really came in was when Barney Frank called about the closing of a small parts warehouse in his state. And that was the only place where really, I would say, overt conversation really probably impacted the decision making. Other than that, it was pretty much straightforward. I mean, the formula for dealers was developed by the GM sales organization, and it was, just the knowledge. Everybody knows that we had too many dealers. Dealers will tell you that. They just don't want it to be them. That's the one that's too many. But we were overrepresented in rural markets because that was GM's strength for a long time, and we were underrepresented in some metro markets. Some metro markets we were overrepresented. So we needed to cut down that number of dealers so that a dealer has a throughput, a number of sales that allows him to invest in his dealership and invest in service and in customer relations. And if you're a dealer just handling a small number of cars, that's not going to happen. You need a volume to generate the kind of profitability that you need. That's the whole concept of taking the numbers down. Better dealers, fewer of them, but better quality dealers.
Following up on Geneva's question about press coverage and relative to Toyota, I've read and heard some criticism of how the automotive press has been pretty soft on the automotive industry relative to uncovering questions like the Toyota problem, and including the Detroit News Press as part of the automotive press. What was your feeling when you were in Michigan and the relationship?
It certainly doesn't feel that way. I can remember back a few years when the New York Times did like a multi-week thing about the alignment of SUVs, normal passenger cars. Certainly, all this stuff is public information. When you decide to do a recall, you have 48 hours to either publicly announce it or have NHTSA put it on their website. So every recall is public knowledge. But there are issues that companies try to work around and do things like customer satisfaction recalls, which are different than a safety recall or an environmental recall. And apparently, Toyota is being accused of some of that. And so some of those things are less obvious. But today, dealers get service bulletins on everything. Those bulletins immediately become public knowledge. You have multiple dealers. Almost every dealer has more than one franchise. So a GM dealer is a Toyota dealer, is a Honda dealer. So there aren't very many secrets within the industry. And my perspective is the media, the automotive media, and the auto industry is probably one of the most covered industries in the United States, that they do a pretty aggressive and good job of covering the industry. I certainly never felt like, gee, we're lucky that we have this really gentle media corps out there. And I think, Toyota had this deep reservoir of goodwill and trust that I think they might have been given a little bit of preferential treatment or the benefit of the doubt in some circumstances. Obviously, it's going to be a lot more difficult for them in the future, but so that might have helped them. But I don't think anybody avoided a story there said, "Oh, gee, I'm not going to do something that I'm aware of." Yep.
Yes, Tom.
Yeah, I'm just curious. It seems one of the big challenges GM faced recently was the perception that their cars were old people cars that didn't appeal to young people. So I'm curious about the decision about which brands they kept, and was there a consideration about maybe a brand new nameplate, even in this time of risk, that might be an
not a
attempt
lot.
to appeal to a different part of the market? It's like Buick, I mean, I know it sells in China, but it's the last car you're going to see in a college campus, for instance.
Well, so far, but if you look at Buick, the average age of a Buick owner was something like 60 to 70.
Right.
And when they brought the Buick Enclave, which is a nice crossover vehicle, they dropped it into the high 50s. The LaCrosse is expected to bring it down, and then there are more vehicles planned for Buick. It's never maybe going to be a 20-something-year-old car, but if they could get it into the 40s, 50s, that would be very manageable. And the other thing that's happening is Toyotas, for instance, Camrys, their average age is creeping up. And a lot of young people don't necessarily want, because their mother and father drove Toyotas.
More youth appeal, right?
Yeah, but it was kind of that was a brand that had been on a downward track for 20, 30 years. Buick, believe it or not, even though numbers are small, was a very profitable brand. And with the equity it has in China, it was felt that was necessary to keep. GMC, why not a lot of people understand, GM sells more pickup trucks, GMC pickup trucks in California than virtually anything else. It's a very strong brand among professionals and construction people and that sort of thing. Chevrolet, of course, obviously is the base brand and does extremely well around the world. It's the fastest growing brand internationally right now. And Cadillac, since they've introduced things like the CTS and the SRX, has come back really strong. It's not real strong internationally yet. It is reputationally, but they don't have the right products yet, the right size products to really compete.
They have been imaginative, I think. They're
and when you see the next generation, like there's like a BMW 3 size Cadillac coming in the next 24 months. When they get that size vehicle, they'll be able to compete much more effectively around the world.
Well, please join me in thanking Steve. We're lucky.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me. Good seeing you.